Sarah Bronin founded Desegregate Connecticut in the wake of the George Floyd tragedy in 2020 as a program of the Regional Plan Association, or RPA. RPA is dominated by billionaire New York developers who are using Desegregate Connecticut to hijack the social justice movement, to scapegoat local zoning to clear the way for high density, as of right apartment developments regardless of environmental and infrastructure constraints. But their ambitions and Miss Bronin's far exceed Little Connecticut, which will serve as a model for other states. Miss Bronin explains all of this to a Vermont Housing Finance Conference in November of 2022.
I'm the Commissioner of Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development. Given Vermont's recent focus on the obstacles and opportunities of zoning, we're lucky to have Sarah Bronin here with us today to share her work on the connections between housing, zoning, and how zoning data can better inform policy and advocacy. Sarah Bronin is a Mexican-American architect, attorney, professor, and policymaker who works at the junction of property, land use, historic preservation, and energy. Her work asks the question, how can law and policy foster more equitable, sustainable, well-designed, and connected places? She is a pioneer in making zoning easier to understand through media appearances and extensive publications with great titles like Zoning by 1,000 Cuts. Vermont has so much to learn from her innovative research, real-world work, including Desegregate Connecticut, an effort to expand housing opportunity in Connecticut by mapping zoning restrictions, promoting transit-oriented communities, advocating for sensible lot sizes for homes, and reducing bureaucracy, which successfully advanced the first major statewide zoning reform in several decades. She's now working to create a national zoning atlas based on her work in Connecticut. I'm hoping we can talk about that here in Vermont. Sarah's work can help us better understand zoning's relationship to housing affordability, accessibility, and diversity, and offers new hope for improving zoning decisions in the future. She's a professor of the Cornell College of Architecture, Art, and Planning, an associate faculty member of Cornell Law School, as well as a Biden-nominated chair of the U.S. Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. She holds a JD from Yale Law School, Master's of Science from University of Oxford, and Bachelor of Arts in Architecture from the University of Texas. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Bronin for a keynote, Unlocking Zoning Potential to Improve Vermont's Housing Stock.
Good morning, everyone. How is everybody today? Good. You guys are chatty. That's great. That's one thing I've noticed in my short time in this room. So I'm really happy to see everybody get together. Thank you to Maura and Leslie and VHFA for having me here today, and to Commissioner Hanford for that very kind introduction. So I'm going to talk today about one of the many tools that people in this room have used, and I know that you come from a variety of backgrounds: public sector, private sector, real estate development, planning, finance, and I know that each of you has an interest in leveraging all the tools in your toolbox to promote more equitable and more housing. So today I'm really honing in on this one small piece of the puzzle, which is zoning. And the reason is zoning, as Commissioner Hanford said, really is zoning codes are the rules of the game. And so unless you have good zoning rules, everything else that you're doing in all those other tools in your toolbox might not be able to be used. So with that, all right, great. With that, I'm going to start with what zoning is. And so everybody in this room is familiar with zoning, right? Raise your hand if you know what zoning is, okay. So my definition of zoning is the local government regulation of land uses, structures, and lots. So sometimes people say, well, zoning is land use regulation, and that's true. It does regulate uses, but it's really important for us to keep in mind that it also regulates the size and bulk of structures as well as the way that lots are developed. So I see it in three parts, really. Zoning can also regulate specific details of construction. So the images that you're seeing here are images from Hartford, Connecticut, where I was a planning and zoning commissioner for 7 years and helped to rewrite the zoning code, and these are images of our new code. In the last image, you saw a map, because of course, zoning codes have both a map, which designates districts and puts land in specific districts, and text. So you have text like this chart that looks at our downtown codes. So where does zoning come from? It comes from state zoning enabling acts. Let me see if I can advance this. But zoning comes from state standard zoning enabling acts. And so those have been around for a century. They were first put out by the U.S. Department of Commerce during the Herbert Hoover era. And 1920s, mid-1920s, and it's pursuant to those model state zoning enabling acts that zoning was enacted all over the country from state legislatures providing local governments with authority to zone. So in a way, zoning is 100 years old, and lots of communities in Vermont probably adopted zoning in those early stages and then continuing on throughout the century. So without slides, I'm going to just keep going. I think the projector's frozen. So you're just going to have to imagine that you can see the words that I'm saying, but it doesn't really matter because it's all really the same thing. All right, so next topic I wanted to talk about was why zoning is important. And so again, lots of you raise your hand, you're familiar with zoning, you know what the consequences of zoning are. And so putting these in maybe big buckets, the most obvious consequence of zoning is its impact on the affordability and the supply of housing. So fair housing, that's what the topic of this conference, one of the reasons you are all here. But of course, along with that comes zoning's consequences on transportation. So if we are regulating our land development through zoning in particular ways, we are regulating land in a way that enables us or prevents us from using cars, using mass transit. If zoning puts lots of uses together in dense areas, that it supports transit. If zoning has large minimum lot sizes, that promotes sprawl and car dependency. So zoning has a huge impact on transportation. It also has an impact on how our infrastructure can develop. So not just our transportation infrastructure, but water, sewer, lighting, energy. Zoning and infrastructure interact in really important ways. So that may be one bucket, housing and infrastructure. A next bucket of ways that zoning impacts our lives is in the area of environment. So the way that we zone has huge impacts on environmental and on our ability to respond to climate change. Again, thinking about how we zone, if we're zoning in ways that create sprawl, we're requiring people to use cars, we are essentially requiring greenhouse gas emissions, we're making it harder for people to walk and bike, especially with things like large minimum lot sizes. Zoning also ensures or prevents our ability to access nature. So if we have zoning that has things like an urban growth boundary where we develop within the boundary and we have access to nature around us, that is a way that we can, that is, again, has consequences. Zoning has impact on our food supply. And of course, I guess the last bucket is the area of opportunity. So economic opportunity, educational opportunity, all of these things are impacted by zoning. If we are zoning single-family only, residential-only neighborhoods without a mix of uses. We're making it harder for people to get back and forth between jobs and educational opportunities. So zoning has these really far-reaching consequences, and in all of the areas of economy and society that we can probably possibly think of. And I think talking about that and just framing it in that way is really important, because otherwise, why are we talking about this possibly arcane area of local government law? And it's, in my opinion anyway, it's because we have these really important consequences. Okay, so, all right, so we'll flip through all of these. Da-da-da-da-da. And now here we are. So, all right, so zoning comes in lots of different forms, and it's the particulars of zoning that make these impacts on all of these areas that I've just discussed even more salient in some places, more dramatic in some places. And so this really brings us to this question: how do we zone now? And how exactly does that particular zoning impact our lives? And I guess I would say that given zoning's importance, I've just told you all of the different areas that zoning has an impact, you'd think that we know all the answers to those questions. But the truth is that we really don't. We don't even really know how we zone today. So you may be familiar with one or two, well, probably lots of you in this room are familiar with lots of zoning codes, because that's your area of specialty. But can you easily compare jurisdictions to each other? Do you know precisely the amount of land that's subject to different zoning rules? And the answer is probably not, because we don't have good tools to do that. Now, the reason this question about zoning has become really important to me over the last few years, of course, I research in this area. I have for the last couple decades, I guess. But the real reason that it became important was through this advocacy effort that I helped to found 2 years ago in Connecticut called Desegregate Connecticut. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that effort and why these questions became particularly important. So Desegregate Connecticut is an advocacy effort based in obviously Connecticut that really was pushing for statewide reforms and convened in the wake of George Floyd's murder to investigate and interrogate how Connecticut's land use laws impact social equity. We expanded our thinking beyond equity and inclusion to include thinking and convening conversations about zoning's impact on prosperity and as well as the environment. So some of these themes that we just discussed in general. Our team, primarily young people, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, really powered this effort that since June 2020, there's been dozens more students and young people who've joined the movement, in addition to our seasoned folks at 80 nonprofit coalition members that have joined the coalition. And I'm just going to pause on this slide because you can see some of the traditional groups that are involved in planning and architecture, like the AIA, the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association, environmental groups like Save the Sound, the Sierra Club, as well as preservation groups. How many preservationists are represented in this room, preservation organizations? All right. Good job. Thank you for being here. I think preservationists are key to the housing conversation, and we had all three of our major preservation statewides involved. But one of the ones that I really wanted to point out, because I see that the Vermont League of Cities and Towns is here today, is that one of our coalition members was the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, which was all of the municipalities in the state of Connecticut. And in many other states, that organization, or the equivalent, I assume this is the equivalent, has not been involved in local zoning and statewide zoning conversations, in part because I think that they fear, well, what might happen if the state gets more involved in zoning? And that's what Desegregate Connecticut was advocating for. But we were really fortunate that CCM in our state kind of saw that this was, the way that we zone was hurting our ability to grow as a state and our town's abilities to really provide for their individual residents. And so to their credit, they got involved and really helped to shape the legislation in a way that worked for towns. And I think I'm hopeful that with the presence of the Vermont League here, that they can also continue to be involved in that conversation. So as we emerged and convened all of these folks, we really just kept getting the same question, which is, okay, so generally you're talking about zoning. Generally you're talking about that it causes these problems. But what about my town? What is my town doing wrong? How does my town compare to other towns? And what exactly does the state as a whole do when it comes to zoning? And the truth is, we could not answer that question. So that was the question that kept coming up over and over again. And that's when we decided that it was time for us to really start digging into the zoning codes themselves, digging into the data and trying to answer that question. So as you know, and here's those Hartford images again, zoning codes include both a map and a text. So what we started to do with our team of, actually that started off with a core team of 10 undergraduates from Yale. They started to gather up all the zoning codes in the state. So it turned out, well, I'll tell you how many in a minute. And we developed a Google sheet, and we just started collecting information about the districts, whether they were mapped, whether they were an overlay, what type of district, was it elderly housing, affordable housing, did it permit 1, 2, 3, and 4 or more family housing? So we developed a methodology for that. Our team, and that was an iterative process. We also started collecting maps. So some maps look like this map from Stamford, Connecticut, a larger city, which has a lot of different parts and a lot of different codes. I think Stamford's code was one of the longest at 400 pages. Westport's was as well. And some of the maps look like this in the smaller towns, rural areas, where they were digitized, but they wouldn't give us the files, so we had to digitize them ourselves, or they were hand-drawn. And these, I don't know if you can see, but the one on the right, I mean, you can hardly tell which district is which. This is one of the beach associations that happens to have been given a special authority for zoning from the state legislature. So we were taking these maps and digitizing them, putting them into a coherent statewide GIS file. So this was pretty time consuming, and so we ended up having about 20, 25 different people, including GIS professionals, including staff at UConn's Center for Land Use Education and Research, including students, master's students, law students, putting this all together. And it was very ad hoc because it was the first time, to our knowledge, that anybody had ever tried to pull all of these pieces together, the zoning code analysis and the mapping, into one coherent framework. So this is an image of Connecticut, and this is actually an image of our zoning map, but it shows the 169 towns. We actually found that there were 180 zoning jurisdictions because of the legislature's special act authority that had been given to non-municipal governments. We found that amongst all of that, there were about 2,600 zoning districts, and we reviewed in total over 32,000 pages of zoning text. So this is not for the faint of heart, but it resulted in the Connecticut Zoning Atlas. So I'm just going to go through, if you can look at this online at zoningatlas.org, and then just click on Connecticut. The Zoning Atlas works like this. First, you select what it is you want to see on the map. So here we've selected one family housing. Then the land meeting the criteria shows up in some shade of purple, and the purple shades the slight differences in purple relate to whether it's primarily residential, a mixed zone, or non-residential zone. The atlas can show if a town primarily zones for single-family housing, allows accessory dwelling units or accessory apartments, zones for multifamily housing, zones for housing in the 1/2 mile radius around rail stations, or we have a Connecticut Fast Track, a bus rapid transit stations near and around Hartford, and it also shows lot sizes. So these are things that you can toggle on and off in our map. In addition to these, we also collected information about a wide range, about 100 characteristics, including setbacks, minimum parking requirements, lot coverage, heights, and so on. Our findings were in my view, pretty dramatic. One of the findings was that 91% of land in Connecticut is zoned for single-family housing as of right. So that's maybe something to be expected in a state that's fairly suburban. 91%, though, is pretty large. We also found that only 2% of land in Connecticut allows for 4 or more family housing as of right. I would bet these numbers are pretty similar in Vermont, maybe even more so, because we have more larger cities, if you consider 100,000 or more large, which we do in Connecticut. It's very large. So I'm from Houston, so I have to give a little, Connecticut is the same population as the city of Houston, and which has no zoning, but we'll get on that topic maybe another time. But 91% versus 2%. And the only way we could have figured that out is by doing that time-consuming mapping process where we were mapping each and every zoning district and highlighting their housing-related characteristics. So just to give you an idea of how this works in New Haven, so New Haven is the kangaroo in the middle there with the 2 train stations. You'll see what I'm talking about. See it now? That was one family house. This is where one family housing is allowed. This is where 2 family housing is allowed as of right. And this big block in orange is, I think, elderly housing, 2-family elderly housing only on existing structures. So that's a little misleading. Here's where 3-family housing is allowed, and here's where 4 or more family housing is allowed. Okay, so what does this map tell you? So if you're familiar with New Haven, you know that New Haven is an urban area. It's a poor city compared to its surrounding suburbs. It's also a much less white city compared to its surrounding suburbs. And East Haven shares some of those characteristics, and you see that multifamily zoning there as well. Work that I'm doing right now with Urban Institute confirms what we probably could have figured out without any of this mapping, which is that multifamily zoning is really corresponding with lower income, a higher percentage of minority areas. So, but if you look at this map, and then you wonder, if you've ever wondered, why is New Haven more affordable? Why is New Haven the place where lower income people tend to gather in the region? It's because there's no way for them to find housing in other areas when much of the surrounding area has large minimum lot sizes and is single family only. Those 2 characteristics probably alone contribute to the cost of housing in the area. So as I said, we logged many different characteristics when it came to housing. So we have accessory apartments, and we have logged lots of different features related to their being permitted. We logged whether public hearings were required. So when I say as of right, that means without a public hearing. That means an administrative approval. I know that these 2 issues, accessory housing and public hearings, and minimum lot size are things you've been talking about in Vermont, and that Act 179 from 2020 addressed the accessory apartments and minimum lot size to some extent. So you're probably familiar with what minimum lot size is. We logged those numbers, the specific number of acres required per lot. Density, minimum unit area, so how big apartments have to be. We found that Darien, Connecticut, for example, required apartments to be 2,000 square feet. We also found Darien required 3 parking spaces for a studio apartment. 3, just in case you needed more parking for your 3 cars than your studio apartment square footage. So minimum parking requirements. We also looked specifically at affordable housing provisions within zoning codes, the maximum number of bedrooms that were permitted. So many towns had, you could build apartments, but they could only be 1 bedroom. They could only be 2 bedrooms. Or you could build apartments, but they can only be 6 units total. So there are caps on number of bedrooms and caps on number of units in apartment buildings. So these are the things that we logged across, again, all of these different towns. And there's a lot to unpack in all of that. And today I'm just going to focus on two areas. And these two areas, again, are areas that you've covered, at least in part, through statewide legislation here in Vermont, started to open the door. So I'm bringing you some stats here and some strategies that we use in Connecticut, just to kind of let you know what we were doing there. So accessory apartments, accessory dwelling units, these are small independent units that are built on the same lot as the larger units. So what did the zoning atlas tell us when it came to accessory apartments? If you just click on the zoning atlas and you say, where are ADUs allowed? It looks like they're allowed in a lot of the state. Good job, Connecticut. Pat yourself on the back, even without statewide ADU legislation. Look at how many ADUs are permitted. Except when you get down to the details, and this is what you're bringing up that topic, zoning by 1,000 cuts. This is where these little other requirements that unless you log them, you don't really understand whether these types of housing, these types of different types of housing are permitted, including ADUs. So if you're looking for an ADU that allows for non-owner occupancy, that allows for people who are not family members or employees, that allows renters, because there are prohibitions on renting in some codes, and that are not restricted to elderly only, this is what you get. So this is a different chart than this, which looks, oh, great, good job. But if you're really thinking about an ADU that might be available on the open market for rent, this is what you see instead. And then here, if you add to that these two physical requirements, that there's no maximum size, so there's often a cap, a number of square foot cap on ADUs, or it's not restricted to the primary structure. So in other words, it can be detached, so let's say over a garage or as a detached unit. You get essentially nowhere. So where could you build a detached unit that's not subject to occupancy requirements, it doesn't have a maximum size limitation? Nowhere. So, or very few places. You can actually build that in Hartford. But so we really started to advocate for this, and the law that we passed, the legislature passed last year, addressed this issue in part, and addressed a lot of those little provisions, like the maximum size, number of parking requirements, number of parking spaces required, capping that at 1, and so on. So we produced a couple of videos. I encourage you to go to desegregate.ct.org, which is the site where you can watch these videos, and I think they're pretty cool. But in terms of advocacy, what we tried to do was we paired the data that we had with these more, I guess, video type and social media type advocacy tools. The second topic I wanted to talk about was minimum lot sizes. So again, you're probably well familiar with this. Zoning codes can dictate how big a lot has to be for a unit of housing to be built. The larger the lot, the fewer homes that can be built. What you're seeing here is actually pretty small minimum lot sizes with shared space in the middle. Crazy finding, in my opinion, of the Connecticut Zoning Atlas, again, using that data, 81% of residential land in the state requires essentially a 1 acre minimum. How big is an acre? It's big, right? I'm sure lots of you who live out in rural areas, that acre is not uncommon. But this went for our suburbs too. This went for areas in cities. Look at Stamford. Half of Stamford, Connecticut is over 1 acre, 1 acre or more zoning. If you look at Greenwich, which is the community closest to New York City, it's 4 acre zoning, as are New Canaan and Darien and some of these other towns. Close to New York City. Even more shocking, half of the land requires, and you can see Greenwich is still purple, half of it's purple there, requires 2 acres per single family home. So what does that do to home prices? But more importantly, or just as importantly, what does it do to sprawl and our ability to build compact developments that people actually want to live in? Not everybody wants to live in this kind of housing. So again, here we use the data. We issued a maybe 30, 40-page issue brief specifically on minimum lot sizes. We did reports, videos. We assembled graphics that we hoped would show people lots of different options for how you can get, in the case of the bottom right, 15 units on 1 acre of land as opposed to 1. And so again, feel free to check out this paper. It's on the Social Science Research Network. It's a free download, and it's will be published soon. Okay, there's lots of other information in the zone that the Zoning Atlas can convey. One piece of information, minimum parking requirements, which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. We should just completely abolish parking requirements for lots of different reasons. That's a no-brainer. This whole state should do it. Actually, Connecticut did cap in its legislation minimum parking requirements, although individual towns can opt out of that. But anyway, so that was bad, but at least we started. And lots of towns or cities across the country are eliminating them. But this image shows you that if all of these other zoning provisions remain the same, how much housing could be built within 3 of the 15 walkable cities that we studied. This is Bridgeport, Norwalk, and Waterbury. What we saw in this data, and you don't necessarily know these cities, but you can probably tell that there are these white lines that are corridors, main streets, so the historic main streets of these towns, and a lot of the housing that it could be built. So the darker purple means lost opportunity. The darker the purple, the bigger the lost opportunity. A lot of the housing that would be built if it were not for minimum parking requirements is housing along those historic corridors. So if you think about what minimum parking requirements do to our small towns, they basically prevent those buildings that are already there from being reused, because to change their use, that triggers zoning compliance, it triggers parking requirements, but it also promotes demolition, and it also shrinks the amount of building that can be built, which shrinks the amount of housing that can be built, if we're focused here on housing. But really, parking requirements go for a mix of uses. I encourage you to check out the issue briefs that Desegregate Connecticut wrote, the environmental case for zoning reform, transit-oriented communities, economic case for it, as well as our playbooks that we made for land use board candidates, commissioners, and just general advocates. How do you talk about zoning? What are the things that you ask for? What are the strategies that you can use? Feel free to plagiarize the language and modify it for Connecticut. I'm happy to give anybody those files. Okay, so with that in mind, so that was our Connecticut approach. We really based our advocacy in this data because people were asking us these really good questions about what Connecticut actually was doing and how we were actually zoning. And now people can go to that zoning atlas and they can click on their town and get all the stats for their town that pops up right on the atlas. So I was asked to just say a few things about what Vermont can do. Of course, you're already doing a lot of stuff statewide. You're convening, you're here, you're talking today with each other, and I know you'll have some great plans for this really great conference as the day unfolds. But I wanted to talk to you, make a pitch for Vermont to join the National Zoning Atlas effort so that you can get some of these advantages of both collaboration with other researchers, but also just the data itself. So we launched the National Zoning Atlas in May, using the Connecticut Zoning Atlas as the example and hoping that other states would use our methodology and join in. And to our surprise, 13 other states have already launched their zoning atlases. And we are working with all of them, convening them through my lab at Cornell to develop their atlases. I'm just going to point out, I'm not putting any pressure on you here. I'll just let this image speak for itself. I'll say, too, that we have teams in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland forming, so that's going to look like a sea of blue, and Vermont's not there yet. The goal of the National Zoning Atlas is to translate and standardize all of this zoning information in hundreds of really indecipherable to the common person pages across these jurisdictions into a standard zoning interface where ordinary people, advocates, policymakers, elected officials, I love that elected officials are in this room, can use the information, and the chips are going to fall where they may. You know, there's no manipulation of this zoning data. You're just going to see what's out there, and you know, whoever wants to use it can start to use it. Developers. All of these states are using this guide that we wrote called How to Make a Zoning Atlas. It's also a free download if you want to check it out. It's just been updated. We update it every month almost to address questions that arise in different places. So some states, for example, have extraterritorial jurisdiction. Some states have different zoning procedures. So we include all of those scenarios in our updated guides. Again, with the map and the text, the biggest requirement is collecting that information. That is sometimes harder than it needs to be. So not every jurisdiction wants to just hand you their zoning codes, even though it's a public document. Sometimes they make you go to their office and physically photograph or Xerox a copy of the zoning code. The methodology requires that all of these types of features of a zoning code be logged. So the type of zoning district, you saw some of these in that initial screenshot, different characteristics about accessory dwellings, planned residential developments. So here you see, again, my own definition of zoning is uses, lots, and structures, and so that's how this guide is organized. Under lots, we have lot size, density, setbacks, lot coverage, parking, connectivity requirements. You probably don't have so much of that here, but we have things like housing can only be built if it's near public transit stop or connected to water or sewer. Actually, you do have that here, actually, in your state law, but we have some of that in Connecticut, and some other places do too. And then structures, floor to area ratio, maximum bedroom, maximum unit, and so on. So different states are taking different approaches. My lab is running the New York Zoning Atlas with lots of different project partners. There's one of my students, he was a project manager, doing a presentation. Montana is, so our project partners are universities, a state agency, and nonprofits like the Regional Plan Association. Montana is another example of they've started to, they're almost done collecting their data. And that's being done by entirely by a nonprofit organization called the Frontier Institute, a libertarian-leaning institute. So there's a big tent here in terms of ideologies, why people are collecting this information. Some people might say, well, this is good for deregulation and the market. Other people might have that social justice angle. So going back to all of these motivations, are you motivated by fair housing? Are you motivated by climate? Are you motivated by opportunity? The zoning data can be overlain on other geospatial data that can really tell us not only just those questions about where people live, but also climate threats, sea level rise. Why are we putting apartment buildings in places that are vulnerable for sea level rise, and so on. So will Vermont join the National Zoning Atlas? I hope so. If you do, you have, I think, almost 300 local governments. If you use the Connecticut numbers, that means there's about 4,000 zoning districts and maybe 50,000 pages of zoning text. However, I bet a lot of your communities don't have zoning. So in Connecticut, your work might actually be pretty light, depending on how many of those towns actually have zoning. In Connecticut, we basically have universal zoning because it is so urbanized, and it's sort of sandwiched between New York and Boston, and so I guess, I don't know, really popular there. But I bet you don't have as much work to do here. If you are interested, there's a page on the Zoning Atlas website that's called Want to Make Your Own Atlas. And there you can find information about assembling a team, links to the how-to guide, and kind of our approach as in terms of our collaborative. We do have 4 staff members existing and incoming in our National Zoning Atlas, I guess, headquarters in our lab. That common how-to guide, which is 100 pages, so it's extremely detailed how you're supposed to collect that information, and a community of researchers and collaborators. So here are, again, you see universities, nonprofit organizations, metropolitan planning authorities like the Chicago Planning Authority, and the MAPC in Massachusetts, as well as funders from different capacities. So please feel free to be in touch with me. I'm going to open for Q&A. There's my Twitter handle. If anybody's on Twitter, I'm always happy to connect. And I think I'll just stop there. Is that good? Yep.
Okay, here's my question. So who in this room do we have to convince, like all of these people, to get us to join the Zoning Atlas? Thanks.
Oh gosh, I mean, it just takes one person. So, we found there's a team emerging in Virginia, and it's basically a grad student who said, I want to do this. So he contacted the APA, local universities, professors, asking people to take specific regions. He's just sort of taking it on himself. There's lots of different ways project teams can emerge. It could come from one of the state agencies. It could come from legislative authority. It could come from a few regional planning authorities banding together. So there's lots of different ways. The way that we've been taking on project teams is, essentially just talking with them, seeing if they have a credible team, and then connecting them with funding resources. So if you don't necessarily have funding resources here, we can probably help find at least some startup funding. Yeah.
Is zoning strictly a state rights issue? Does the federal government have any role in this, or does the federal government have plans possibly in the future to address the inequalities by the zoning issues as a federal issue?
Yeah, so you might have seen a few months ago, President Biden released an executive order indicating that that the administration aspired to connect certain housing or certain federal programs with zoning progress. And so after announcing that, I think maybe they realized, well, we don't have a baseline for how communities zone now, so how are we going to know whether they've made progress? And so we've been talking a bit with the White House and with HUD about how the National Zoning Atlas can be used to help them at least establish a baseline now and see what aspects of zoning might be important to incentivize. So, for example, if it's minimum lot size that's driving housing supply and affordability issue, which it probably is, and our research can probably show that, then you focus maybe on reducing the amount of large lot zoning in a community. So what is that differential, and how will the administration reward that? Beyond that, incentive type arrangements, I don't think that the federal government has any specific plans, although there's definitely some discussion in the Senate and particularly in the Senate about the federal government's role in zoning because of its impacts on interstate commerce. So at least there is some kind of hook there. But for now, and for the last century, it's really been states that are in charge of enabling and making the rules. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm wondering how the state and the legislature dealt with cooperation or pushback from the local towns who have had zoning in place for a long time. And how did you deal with red line districts, so-called red line districts, which I would imagine Connecticut has quite a few of?
Well, redlining really refers to, at least in my my experience, that historical more of a bank policy type districting, as opposed to zoning, which is land use regulation. So I think we can probably, and in fact, some have started to overlay those historical redlining maps with current zoning, finding that the areas that were zoned, C and D, sort of lower quality neighborhoods, tend to be those neighborhoods that still have lower income demographic characteristics, but also are zoned for multifamily housing. So I think there's a correlation there. Your first question about resistance. So I actually think that with knowledge about what zoning is and does, people get very interested in changing it. And certainly there's a knee-jerk reaction out there by individual people, by some local elected officials that might say, well, it's always been this way, we don't want to change it. And I think that status quo bias affects policymaking across lots of different spheres. The opportunity we have, and you referenced that, housing is having a moment this morning. The opportunity that we have right now is that people are taking more of an interest. And so although we saw some pushback from especially towns down in the Fairfield County, close to New York City area, we actually saw elected officials from small towns and big towns, New Haven, Hartford, Pomfret, small town, testify at that hearing for the bill that eventually passed in favor of the legislation. Because again, I think as people gain more understanding about what zoning is, they realize that what their neighbors do, what they do, it's sort of all related. And so to have guidance that presents a more unified approach to land use regulation across jurisdictions actually can help some of these towns achieve their population growth goals in a slow growth state. Yeah, there's definitely always going to be resistance. But I think part of what we were trying to do through Desegregate Connecticut is arm ordinary people with information about their own zoning so that they could go to their elected officials and start to turn that tide away from just the status quo bias.
Is there a type of current use in Connecticut for your rural areas, current use program? Or use value program, I should say.
Not the way that, maybe not the way that Vermont does it, no. Yeah, we don't have an Act 250.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ariel Jensen Vargas. One of the things that you mentioned very briefly is something just that I would kind of bring into a focus is the ADUs allowing for farm workers to live on the property. There is a significant population of Mexican farm workers in Vermont. And those people are actually living on the property of the farmer. Some of those Mexican farm workers are not actually legally here in this country. So this kind of emphasizes the fact that these are people that are living on their employer's land, giving that landowner a lot of power. When we're talking about Connecticut, we're talking about the fact that with such a scarcity of rental housing, that means that if you lose your rental housing, the ability to find another rental in a maybe 30-day block of time is so difficult that actually adds to the disparity of power between the landlord and the tenant. And that's just something that I would like to emphasize, is that these zoning laws are really impacting the tenants as well in terms of having no power to control their lives.
Yes, and I think that's a great point. So across the country, we have a housing shortage. We don't have enough housing for people. And what that means is that, especially in the renters context, we see that landlords have much more power because renters can't move. They don't have that ability to exit, as we talk sometimes in the economics literature. They can't move, and even when they would like to, the housing that they want to find is more expensive. If we created more housing, tenants would have more opportunities to do that. The issue of the farm worker housing is interesting. We don't have good data on that because that is. So in one way, you could consider it, well, maybe this is multifamily housing because you have multi unrelated people living on the same lot, but it's not really, kind of skew the numbers to count that sort of temporary work-dependent housing as multifamily housing equivalent to, say, an apartment building in Burlington. So one thing that states have been doing is where you have those specific conditions. So if there's lots of farm worker type housing here, you create a new column where you collect that data for Vermont, even if it's not collected in Connecticut. So that's definitely an option. Thanks.
One thing that I've been very curious about for a long time, my observations, which I'm sure you've seen plenty of times, the wealthier communities declining to have, to accommodate housing for lower income people. So I've always thought that it might be appropriate for the state to say every community needs to zone for housing to accommodate their share of the state's entire population. Just to make it fair, just to say across the entire state, okay, every rich town has to be ready to provide housing for a low-income component of the entire state. What do you think of that?
So what you're talking about is fair share legislation. So New Jersey is a state that has a fair share regime as a result of court cases, the Mount Laurel decision, that have in turn resulted in a state agency being created and housing being constructed that enables municipalities across New Jersey to bear more of what is their fair share than they have in the past. That has resulted in housing being created in New Jersey, but in some ways it has resulted in housing that's not necessarily in the right places. So for a state like Connecticut, where you have a lot of rural areas and suburban areas, my bias is, and this is just my bias is that what we should be doing is building new housing in places where we have existing infrastructure, not dispersing housing out to places where people can't, even if they do have an inexpensive apartment, they can't access the services that they need. So our thought through Desegregate Connecticut is that instead of focusing on the fair share model, which was developed in the 1970s and 80s of thinking, is that we should focus on areas that already have water and sewer, which is not all of Connecticut, but also areas around transit stations. So we have 61 transit stations, 61, 62, if you count up the rail and the Connecticut fast track stations. And simply by rezoning those to allow for 15 units per acre could create hundreds of thousands of new housing units, as long as that housing is permitted as of right. So I haven't emphasized enough the power of public hearings to kill housing. Because people who show up at public hearings are the people who already live in a town. They're not people who don't yet live in that town, but want to live in that town. And even when those people show up at hearings, they're shouted down or things get, I'm sure not in Vermont, but in some places, people are not very polite. So the reason, I think Vermont has a lot of respect for planning, but the planning has to translate into regulations that enable those plans to be developed. And once you've planned, and once you've changed the regulations to develop that kind of housing in the way that you've planned for, there really should not be a need for additional public hearings for individual housing applications. Oh, wow. Great. So eliminate public hearings for housing, as long as you write the rules. So in Hartford, for example, we have a form-based code. We know exactly what's going to be built. We know how tall it's going to be. We know where it's going to be situated with respect to the street line. We know even what kind of roof it's going to be. Maybe that's too prescriptive, but Hartford is very historic, lots of historic neighborhoods, so we wanted to kind of provide some parameters. There are no public hearings in the city of Hartford for any housing. And that's how we wanted it. And there's no parking requirements either. There's bike parking requirement. It's like lawless over there. But that's how we wrote the rules intentionally, because again, in a slow growth state, in a struggling city, what we want is development that fits, is compatible with our neighborhoods, but also is easy to build. So if you're frustrated here in Vermont, you're a real estate developer, come to Hartford. I'll put that little plug in here too. My husband would be who's the mayor of Hartford, would be mad at me if I didn't put that plug in. All right, I think this is the last question.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. It was a really cool talk. I'm a computer science student at the University of Vermont, so I'm really super interested in what you had to say. I don't know if you noticed, but there's a big hole in the middle of Burlington. We call it the pit, and it's one of the problems that kind of created the pit was like a reliance on private development and a lack of community control and equity in development. And I'm just curious how you think of zoning, balancing encouragement of private development while also considering equity and community control.
So I think the best path to equity is kind of what I was just saying, is that if you have parameters within which private development can occur, and you make it so that people can't block, especially housing, I'm really talking about housing, then you will it'll be much faster for a community to create housing and create opportunities. I'm not familiar with the pit, but I'll have to check it out sometime today. So, I mean, I think, so for me, I mean, I've worked in real estate development. I obviously care about equity too, as you can see through Desegregate Connecticut. I think there is a way to balance. I mean, just the way, I mean, I've written about in other areas, there is a way to balance historic preservation and affordable housing and historic preservation and renewable energy. To me, these are design problems. In the case of zoning, it's a legal design problem. In the case of historic preservation and ADA compliance, that's a architectural design problem. These are design problems, and if you design the system with that goal, equity in mind, and you say, you know, we're going to approve in this town apartment buildings with X% affordable units, just as of right, we're just going to do that. You know, that may even be a start of it. I do want to say one more thing, since you're a computer science major. One of the things that we are hoping to do with this National Zoning Atlas project is use machine learning to more quickly read zoning codes and code them. And if we're able to get some funding for that, we have a grant into the National Science Foundation, we will be one of the first projects that has these really complicated 200-page legal texts where a machine can go through them and actually spit out at least a good chunk of information that we might be able to use for the zoning atlas. So don't wait too long, Vermont, but if you you might benefit from some of that research and accelerate your work. But I think that's going to be a very cool new frontier in computer science and at the intersection of computer science and law. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
This video provided as a public service of CT 169 Strong. Please subscribe to our channel and share feedback in comments below.